We all know the feeling of being stun-locked to death. You try to do anything in a team fight, only to get hit with stun after root after silence until you die. All because your counterspell was on cooldown. You feel forced to buy Unstoppable just to even think about pressing your ultimate because it's impossible to use it otherwise. Then, you take a look at the patch notes, excited to see what Valve has done to solve the issue of crowd control, only to discover that they added new heroes with even more hard CC, and that they gave a massive nerf to Debuff Remover. What on earth is Valve thinking? Crowd control is a serious problem in Deadlock right now, and I think it's about time someone started talking about it. Even though the latest major update was a ravishing success, it has only made the problem of crowd control even worse, and it's exacerbated tenfold in Street Brawl, Deadlock's latest game mode. Now, before you click off the video thinking that I'm just going to be ranting and raving for the whole runtime about why crowd control sucks, that's not the purpose of this video. I want to open up a discussion with the Deadlock community about this issue so that we can diagnose just how severe this problem is and what the most effective solutions are. I have a few ideas of my own for how we can solve this problem, which I'll be discussing towards the end of the video. But first, it's important to understand what the purpose of crowd control even is. Let's make one thing very clear. Crowd control is a necessary and important feature for games like Deadlock to have. If Deadlock were to lose all its crowd control tomorrow, it would be a very boring and imbalanced game. Crowd control serves two functions. It needs to make the game more interesting and offer distinct counterplay options to keep characters with high damage, mobility, and utility in check. Abilities like Dynamo and Lash's ultimate make the game so much more engaging to play because they force you to think differently about your positioning and ability usage. Meanwhile, abilities like Knockdown and Silence Wave offer counterplay options against flying characters like Vindicta or ability-focused heroes like Pocket. Furthermore, items like Curse give you a powerful way to deny enemy carries that have snowballed a bit too hard, which is a very necessary tool to have. In a vacuum, there is nothing wrong with any of these abilities, and in fact, in the laning stage or small skirmishes with just a handful of players present, there is almost no crowd control issue in Deadlock. There are still some ridiculously annoying combos, like being hooked into Mo and Krill's ultimate, but they can be mitigated much more easily than when you get slammed with half a dozen CC effects in a team fight. You see, when more than half the lobby is present, that's when CC becomes overwhelming. This is because most characters have at least one crowd control ability, whether it's Seven's Stun, Wraith's Ult, or Haze's Sleep Dagger. Some heroes have even more than that, like Billy with his 3 displacing abilities, Paige with her root and stun, or Viscus with all 500 of his puddle punches and stuns in Goo Ball. Furthermore, supports like Rem and Dynamo are encouraged to buy items like Knockdown and Curse to support their team, which adds even more crowd control into the fray. So, when it's time for a team fight and everybody is trying to wrest control of the match by any means necessary, it's an inevitability that someone is going to get stun-locked to death. Whether it's you, the Abrams on your team trying to initiate, the 7 who just ulted in the middle of the battlefield, or the unlucky Paige who was caught out of position, someone is going to have a miserable experience where they don't get to be in control of their own character for the entire fight. Their agency will be stripped from them, and the only impact they'll have on the fight is that they died and left their team at a disadvantage. But Andrew, I hear you saying, what about all the items and abilities you can use to counter crowd control? Isn't this just a skill issue? You're right, there are many ways to defend yourself from crowd control. Some heroes like Viscus and Pocket have inherent abilities that can protect them from crowd control if they have good enough reaction time to block the effects before they hit. Defenseless characters like Infernus can still buy Counterspell, Dispel Magic, or Unstoppable to mitigate the effects of crowd control in a fight. Oh, and then there's also Blood Tribute and Weighted Shots for some base debuff resist if you're a weirdo. You can also use Ethereal Shift or Warpstone to dodge certain crowd control effects, but Warpstone won't always work, and E-Shift is only viable on a couple of niche heroes. However, I am of the opinion that this simply isn't enough. There aren't enough options to defend yourself from crowd control compared to the myriad crowd control abilities that exist in Deadlock. How many new ways to CC the enemies have been added in the past year through the dozen new heroes in the game? And how many new ways to counter crowd control have they added? Well, Counterspell was introduced when they reworked the item shop, but that's about it. There are only a handful of ways to counter crowd control in this game, and they're not exactly consistent. Counterspell is extremely skill dependent and can often be harder to use than the crowd control effects you're countering. It's really only good against telegraphed attacks anyways, but some crowd control effects are instant and very difficult to block. Furthermore, once you block one ability, it goes on cooldown, leaving you vulnerable to being crowd controlled for the next 20 seconds. Unstoppable is a tier 4 item, which makes it very difficult to justify for a lot of heroes because they have to go out of their way to purchase it and it stalls their other damage upgrades from getting online. It's the most powerful CC counter in the game, but it really only makes sense to buy on heroes who have game-winning ults like Lash, Dynamo, and Seven. Then there's Debuff Remover, which got gutted in a recent update. It used to provide 30% debuff resist and upgrade from Debuff Reducer, but now it simply doesn't. You get no debuff resist and no stepping stone to upgrade to this item. You can still remove debuffs on a staggeringly long cooldown, but that passive debuff resist is missing. I can't for the life of me understand why they would make such a backwards decision. Instead of making it easier to counter the overwhelming amounts of crowd control in this game, they made it harder by nerfing the most popular and necessary crowd control resistance item in Deadlock. This unconscionable nerf is the straw that broke the camel's back and inspired me to make this video. It simply doesn't make sense. Now, solving the problem of crowd control being overwhelming isn't as easy as just buffing debuff resistance to the moon, and there are a couple of reasons why. First, a lot of crowd control abilities simply aren't affected by debuff resist. There are multitudes of hard CC effects in this game, whether it's Bebop's Hook, Lash's Death Slam, or Dynamo's Singularity. These will all be 100% effective regardless of how much debuff resist you have. Crowd control like this can only be countered by something that blocks abilities outright, like Counterspell or Riposte. Second, buffing debuff resist would absolutely kill anyone who relies on status effects like Infernus or Pocket. Remember, crowd control is only one side of the debuff coin. There are also loads of damage over time effects that would be gutted if debuff resist scaled as high as 50 or 75%. Furthermore, status effects like anti-healing and inhibitor would be harmed by this too, and the last thing we need is to nerf anti-heal. The third reason is a bit flimsy, but it's still something to consider. Super buffing debuff resist would make crowd control almost a non-factor in small fights where there's only one or two crowd control abilities to consider. The reason why this argument doesn't hold up as well is because Counterspell already does this. If you're taking a 1v1 with Wraith, you can just Counterspell her ult and then kill her. Having high crowd control resistance instead of Counterspell would actually improve Wraith's odds, but it would still result in her ult being super weak. So, with all these factors to consider, how can we solve the issue of crowd control being too overbearing in Deadlock? Well, the answer is multifaceted, and the first step is to separate crowd control and debuff resistance. I believe that crowd control and other debuffs like damage over time and anti-healing being countered by the same stat makes debuff resistance difficult to balance. Here's how this would look. An item like Debuff Reducer could still provide 25% debuff resistance, but it would also provide a higher value of crowd control resistance on top of that, something like 30 or 35%. Valve could also make specialty items that give a high amount of just crowd control resistance. For example, they could make a tier 3 item called CC Resilience that grants 40% crowd control reduction with an additional 20% while below 35% health, similar to Spirit or Bullet Resilience. Obviously, these are example numbers, and the actual balance for such an item would probably look different, but you get the idea. Stacking multiple items with crowd control resistance would also diminish against each other, just like how debuff resistance and damage reduction do already. This would prevent someone from getting unintentionally high crowd control resistance from stacking all the CC resist items in the game. By separating the two resistances, the door would be open for Valve to fine-tune how much protection players are able to get, while having the option to create new items in the process. It would allow players to gain more crowd control resistance without gutting heroes like Infernus and Pocket who rely on debuffs to deal damage. Furthermore, Valve should improve the inherent chain CC resistance that players already have in Deadlock. You see, Valve introduced a system some time ago that makes crowd control effects less effective against you if you get hit with them repeatedly in a short time frame. For example, if you get stunned 3 times in quick succession, the third stun will be weaker than the first stun. This system exists to make crowd control more bearable in teamfights without sapping its effectiveness in smaller skirmishes, and it's a brilliant idea. However, I think that it needs to be stronger than how it is now. There are a couple ways that this could be buffed. First, the window for diminishing CC could be lengthened to allow for more time for this chain CC resistance to kick in. Sometimes this effect doesn't actually do anything because the stuns are just barely spaced out far enough that you don't get any extra resistance. Second, the effect could simply be more powerful. Giving the players more CC resistance with each stun they get hit by in quick succession would make getting stun locked much more bearable. Third, this effect could apply to multiple forms of crowd control instead of only working when you're overloaded with one type of CC. Instead of needing multiple stuns in a row to kick in, it could also reduce the effect of being silenced if that silence happens while you're stunned, or reduce the effect of a stun that hits you while you're cursed. Doing some combination of these things would make CC much more tolerable in teamfights without dampening its effectiveness in 1v1s and other small engagements. One more thing Valve could do to nerf CC is to dampen the effect of duration items like superior duration. Now, I don't think duration needs to be gutted as a mechanic, but I do think that it needs to operate similar to how cooldown reduction does now, where it's significantly harder to get cooldown reduction for items than it is for regular abilities. As it stands, superior duration lets you boost the duration of all crowd control items in the game, including knockdown, silence wave, and curse. Because of this broken synergy, heroes like Rem can curse you for 4 seconds straight, which is a miserable experience. Of course, Valve already has the blueprint for how to remedy this if they so choose. They could remove the ability for superior duration to affect items and nerf it to a value like 25%, and then add a new item called Transcendent Duration that extends the buff to items once more and scales up to 30%. This has worked marvelously for cooldown reduction, and I don't see why they couldn't do the exact same thing with duration. And if the situation is really dire, they could blanket nerf the duration of certain crowd control effects like they've done in the past with spirit and gun damage. For example, if it's deemed that there is just too much movement lockout thanks to Graves and Venator having a bunch of traps alongside Warden and Page, then they could just nerf the duration of all immobilization by 10%. That's an easy and direct way to make crowd control less oppressive in this game. Similarly, they could nerf the cooldowns of numerous crowd control abilities that are too impactful. This is more of an indirect nerf to crowd control in the sense that abilities will still be just as strong, but you'll have to be more deliberate with when you use them. For example, they could finally nerf the cooldown of Bebop's dang hook, which has been the bane of my existence ever since I started playing this game. The final way to make crowd control more tolerable is to create entirely new items that deviate from the concept of merely reducing or evading crowd control. Reactive Barrier is one of my favorite items in the game because it gives a powerful barrier whenever you get hard CC'd, and Valve could expand on this idea with a whole host of other items that benefit your character when CC'd. This is where we can get really creative, so let me know what sort of interesting items you can come up with in the comments section down below. They could really go in any direction with this. They could add an item that gives you healing over time every time you get crowd controlled, or they could create an item that gives you stacking temporary bullet and spirit resist with each CC effect that hits you. There could be an active item that pulses out a wave of damage every time the enemies CC you. Not quite giving you CC immunity, but discouraging the enemies to engage with their CC tools during the active window. The possibilities really are endless. Now, before we end off, I'd like to quickly address Street Brawl. No matter how bad you think crowd control is in normal Deadlock, it's much worse in Street Brawl. This is because items like Knockdown and Superior Duration are abundant, while Dispel Magic and Counterspell are rare. Furthermore, the entire premise of the game mode is that you're constantly teamfighting, so the chances of you getting chain stunned are much higher. Some of the solutions I discussed earlier, like buffing chain CC resistance, would also affect Street Brawl, but I think that Street Brawl's item shop could be adjusted to offer counterplay items more frequently than it does now. The game is already weighted to give each hero items that are favorable to them more often than not, but there's still a stark lack of counterspell and dispel magic in my experience. By having more opportunities to pick these, we'd run into fewer issues where you're playing Vindicta for the first time in forever and the enemies have multiple knockdowns while you can't even buy debuff remover. Yes, I'm still mad about that. Ultimately, I'm just fed up with being stun-locked in Deadlock. I love this game and I love most of its crowd control abilities, but there comes a point where there's just too much CC in teamfights and not enough ways to counter it. I want to see Deadlock expand and improve its options to counterplay crowd control, while also nerfing crowd control in smart ways that still make it feel impactful without being overbearing. But what do you think about the state of crowd control in Deadlock? Do you agree with my analysis, or is there something that I've missed? Let me know in the comments section down below, and while you're down there, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss out on future videos from me. But with all that being said, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you all next time. Peace out.